Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Peh He. We're talking about various ways of acquiring movable items. If I want to buy an apple from you and I pick it up, that works anywhere, even in the middle of the street, and certainly in a private domain. By lifting it up, that certainly becomes mine. But now we're going to focus on acquiring something through a vessel. Let's say I have a container, a 1-gallon container, and I want to come and I want to buy some oil from you. So you pour the oil into my container. So where does that work? For sure, if it's on my private domain and you're pouring it into my container, that for sure will work. But what if it's in your domain? What about a public domain or a shared courtyard or an alleyway? That's going to be the focus right now. רב ושמואל דאמרי תרוויהו, כליו של אדם קונה לו בכל מקום, חוץ מרשות הרבים. ורבי יוחנן ורבי שמעון בן לקיש דאמרי תרוויהו, אפילו ברשות הרבים. So we start off with a machloket between the early sages in Bavel versus the early sages in Eretz Yisrael. Rav and Shmuel, both first generation Amoraim in Bavel, they agree that a person's vessels can acquire something before him in all places except for in the public domain. Other places is fine, but if we're in the middle of Fifth Avenue, traffic is going, horses, people going, so I don't have a right to just put down my container and start doing business in the middle of the street. That's not proper. You can maybe stop for a second to rest or to put something down, to take a breath, but to start making business deals in the middle of the street, that's not what the street is made for. People will get annoyed from you. And therefore, one does not have a right to use the public domain for that purpose of making business deals, and therefore that doesn't count. I will not acquire it if it's done in the public domain. But in all other places, like in a shared courtyard, yes, then my vessels can acquire something for me. Again, we're assuming that let's say you're pouring the oil into my container while my container is on the ground and I'm not picking it up. If I'm holding it or I pick it up, then that's lifting it up. That works anywhere. But just pouring it into the vessel on the ground will not work if it's in the public street, according to Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish, however, disagree, and they say even in the public domain, once I put my container down, maybe it's not so busy at a certain time, and you pour the oil into my vessel, so it's my vessel, it makes a little domain, that's mine, and it can even work in Reshut Harabim. So it seems from a simple reading that these Amoraim have a controversy. They disagree about whether a vessel can acquire something for the owner of the vessel in the public domain. However, Amar Papa la pediger. Papa says actually they are not arguing with each other. They're talking about two different cases. Kan b'reshut harabim, kan besimta, ve'amai karu la reshut harabim, she'en reshut hayachid. Papa says they're not arguing. Rav and Shmuel are talking about an actual public thoroughfare like the middle of Fifth Avenue. And that's where it does not work. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, they're talking about an alleyway on the side, let's say the sidewalk or on the side of the sidewalk, where if you would have to have a conversation while you're walking, you can't stop even in the middle of the sidewalk, lots of people walking, but you go to the side where people will stop for a smoke, where there's homeless people lying down there, and you can stop on the side in a little indentation or a little alleyway that is off of the public domain. That's an area where people will, and they have a perfect permission to stop there for a few minutes. I mentioned an example like a phone booth, and they want to have a conversation, they want to make a little business deal there, so they have a right to do so. And that's where Rabbi Yochanan and Shakish said that you can do it in, that's what they call the Reshut Harabim. Now why did they say the words Reshut Harabim if they actually meant an alleyway? Or what they meant by public domain, that it's not a private domain. It's not my courtyard, it's not your courtyard, it's not a single person's courtyard, but rather it's a public area. But they didn't mean really in the middle of the street, they meant an alleyway on the side. So now everybody's in agreement. You cannot acquire with vessels in the middle of the street, but you can acquire with vessels in the alleyway on the side of the street. הכי נמי מסתברה, דאמר רבי אבהו אמר רבי יוחנן, כליו של אדם קונה לו בכל מקום שיש לו רשות להניחו. יש לו רשות אין לו רשות לשמאמינה. And this interpretation of Rav Papa makes sense. I mean, it seems like, he's reinterpreting, and Rav Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan, it looks like they're actually arguing, right? You have these statements here. We don't know if they said these statements all together. Did they meet all together? They're living in different countries. So Rav Shmuel said one thing, and the Rabbi Yochanan said his laws, and so we have these two traditions, and somebody put them back to back. So it looks like they're arguing with each other, but Rav Papa says no. I think that they are not arguing. They're using same terminology, but they mean different things. And we add that this actually makes sense because the Rabbi Yochanan himself says that vessels of a person can acquire in all places that he has a right to put it down. What does that mean? Where he has a right to put it down, yes, it does acquire it. But in a place where he does not have a right to put it down, meaning in the public thoroughfare, then he cannot do so. So you see, it's evident from this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, we can use this statement to clarify what he says back in this statement, that when he says Reshut Harabim, then he must mean that this is talking about an alleyway, right, where he does have the right to use it. But if it's an area where he does not have a right to use it, well, where would that be? I mean, it could be in a place that you're trespassing into someone else's property. I guess it could be that, right? But it would make sense that this is also going to include Reshut Harabim. So since Rabbi Yochanan said that in a place that you do not have a right to use for business, you do not acquire it. So it makes sense that when he said the Reshut Harabim, it works, he meant an alleyway. Okay, so now we are good. Nobody's arguing. Everybody seems to agree that you can use private vessels, your own vessels in an alleyway, and certainly in your own private domain, but you cannot use them in the middle of the street. But now we're going to challenge that conclusion from the following baraita. Tashema. It's a long baraita, and the question will come afterwards. Arba midot b'mochrin. There are 4 cases regarding sellers. The 4 cases are referring to different domains. The entire Resha is talking about the first case. Ad shelo nitmalea mida lamocher, mi shenitmalea mida lalokeach. Let's say you're pouring oil into my gallon container. And so while you're pouring it, you can renege on it. You didn't finish pouring. It's filling up. It's like a quarter of the way, a third way, and so on. And then the seller says, I changed my mind. I don't want to sell it to you. So he can renege because I, the buyer, I do not acquire it yet while it's still filling up. However, once it's filled up, if I say I'm buying a gallon, and then, you fill it up, and it reaches the top, it reaches the gallon marker, then that's it. At that moment that it's full, that's when the acquisition kicks in, and then that's it. It's mine, and the seller can no longer renege. Okay, b'meh devrim amorim, b'midah she'ena shel shenehen. Avay ma'ita midah shel achat mehen, rishon kana. When is that true, that one does not acquire it while it's getting filled up? That's only if the container does not belong to either of them. Let's say we go to some place and there's a container lying around that anyone can come and use, and you say, okay, let's use this container here, and the seller is pouring the oil and it didn't fill up yet. He didn't do any. He didn't give it to me yet. It's not mine yet. It's his oil. It's in someone else's container. I don't acquire it yet. But once it gets full, then he finished doing what he's doing, and so now it's mine. So that this distinction only applies when it's a third-party container. But if the container belongs to one of them, there's different interpretations. What does that mean? One of them, either one or only the buyer? Let's go with only the buyer, and it's much easier to read that way. So if the container belongs to the buyer, then he gets every drop of oil as it goes into my container. I acquire that, and the seller cannot renege because this is my container, so I continuously own the rights to whatever goes into my container, which makes sense. Now, when is that true? We have now a distinction within a distinction. Bereshut harabim ubechaser she'ena shel shenehem. Aval bereshut mocher lo kana ad shehigbihenu or ad sheyosienu mershuto. When is that true? That if it's in my container, then I acquire it immediately, every drop that falls in. That's only when my container is in the public domain. This is where our question is going to be from. Right here it says public domain, or in a courtyard that belongs to neither of us. It's someone else's courtyard. This is also part of the challenge that we're going to have. It says public domain or courtyard that's nobody. So that sounds like the Reshut Harabim doesn't mean an alleyway. It means something that doesn't belong to any of us, that we're both trespassing there. We don't have a right to be there. So it says here that I would acquire something in a third party area or in the Shut Rabim. So, and that's a case where if it's my vessel and it's in the Shut Rabim, I acquire it continuously. So we'll come back to this because that's the question, but we have to finish the whole Baraita. Aval b'Reshut Mocher, if it's in the seller's domain, let's say I go to someone's store and he's selling the oil in his store, and I bring my container and I say, can you fill this up with oil? Then I do not acquire it until I actually pick it up or leave the store, because I'm in his store, so the whole thing is his domain, and therefore I cannot acquire it just by going into my vessel. When it's in his store, he can always say, hey, no, you can't leave, I changed my mind, I want it back, unless I pick it up even while I'm in the store, but Hagbaha works everywhere, or I leave the store, I pull it out or something, and it goes out of the store. Okay, so this is the second. Remember we said we're going to see 4 laws. We're talking about 4 cases. So the first case is Reshut Harabim, or a courtyard that belongs to neither of us. That was the law before. And now the second law is when it's in the store of the seller, and in that case, one has to pick it up or take it out of the store. The third case is B'Reshut Lokeach, Kevan Shekipel Alav Mocher, Kana Lokeach. Let's say it's in my domain. I'm at home, and then the seller comes, he's going door to door, and he's selling some oil, and he pours it into my container that's in my domain. The Gemara later will talk about whose container did it belong to in the seller when I went to the store. And actually it's going to conclude that it's the seller's property, the seller's container in his store, which makes sense because if I'm in the seller's store, it's probably his container, then I'll transfer it. But the Gemara will talk about that in a second. So if the if the seller comes to my house and he pours it in while in my house, once the seller agrees to sell it, then that's it. The buyer acquires it immediately. As long as the seller, indicated, okay, this is the price, this is going to be, this is yours, then that's it. You don't have to do anything because it's in my property already. So that's simple. That's a simple case. B'Reshut hala hamufkadim eslo lo kana ad shekabel alav o ad sheyiskor et mekoman. And the fourth and final case is if the oil, let's say, is in a third-party warehouse. Someone is watching it for him in some warehouse, and it's in a barrel over there. And now the seller and buyer, neither of them have the oil with them, it's somewhere else, and they agree on the price and the terms, and now you want to actually make an acquisition. The only way to do that, without going and picking it up, is for the owner of the warehouse, the watchman, will agree, take upon himself to give you that spot or rent to you that spot, rent it to the buyer, and then the buyer can acquire it by owning that area where that barrel of oil is. That's the last case. Okay, that finishes the Baraita. Now we see that there's 4 different domains, and in each domain there are different halachot. What's the point for us? Katane miha b'Reshut harabim u'b'chaser she'ena shel shenehen. Well, the main thing for us is the first case that says if you're in a public domain or a courtyard that belongs to in neither of them, she'ena shel shenehen, then one can acquire something with, if it's mine, that was this last case, if it's my container and you're pouring it into my container, then I acquire it continuously. Every drop that falls in, I can acquire it. That means that one can acquire something using his own vessel, even in the Reshut Harabim. And that challenges all the opinions of the early Amoraim, because we concluded that all of them agree that one cannot acquire in a vessel in the Reshut Harabim. So how can we reconcile all of these early Amoraim against this Baraita? And the answer is, Ma'ala b'Reshut Harabim mamash, is part of the question. So doesn't this mean, when the Baraita says Reshut Harabim, it means actually in the middle of the street? And the answer is La Simta. No, it means an alleyway when it says Reshut Harabim, also in the Baraita. Just like we said that for Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, when they said Reshut Harabim, they meant an alleyway. So too we reinterpret the Baraita also. But it's harder to do in the Baraita because hold on, it says Reshut Harabim or an alleyway that belongs to neither of them. So doesn't that mean it's the middle of the street because it's something similar, equal, parallel to an alleyway, a courtyard that belongs to neither of them, a courtyard that belongs to neither of us. Neither of us have rights to use, and that would be the same as the middle of the street that neither of us have a right to use. If it's an alleyway people do have a right to use. That's a public agreement that anyone who wants to can go into an alleyway, and you can go there for a half hour and do your private business deals, and everybody's okay with that. So an alleyway is more like a shared courtyard that we both have a right to use. So from the fact that it compares it to a courtyard that belongs to neither of them, doesn't that mean it's the middle of the street? And yet it says that you can acquire something there in a vessel? And we answer, "Mai chaser shenashil shenehem nameh, dela dehai kula, vela dehai kula, ela detarvaihu." Oh, and what does it mean indeed when it says courtyard that is not of either of them? Oh, what it actually means is doesn't all belong to the buyer, nor does it all belong to the seller, but rather it belongs to both of them. So that phrase, although it sounds like a courtyard that's neither of theirs, we initially understood it to mean, and maybe that's what it means in the simple reading, that it belongs to neither of them at all, but to someone else entirely. So now we interpret that to mean it belongs to neither of them exclusively, but rather it belongs to both of them. They both have a right to it. It's a shared courtyard. So the parallel to a shared courtyard is an alleyway that also people can go and use together. And so now the Baraita is in agreement with the opinions of those early Amoraim that if it's an alleyway, then one's vessels can acquire on behalf of him. But if it's in a public domain, then they cannot. Next, we have a question. Be'amine Rav Sheshat me Rav Huna, kelav shelokeach birshut mocher, kana lokeach o lo? Question is, Rav Sheshat asks Rav Huna, what if you have the vessels of a buyer in the domain of the seller, meaning like the seller's store? The buyer goes into the store and he puts down his container on the floor and says, can you fill this up with oil? Does that work? Can one acquire something in one's vessel, his own vessel, but he's in the domain of the other person, of the seller? That's his question. And Rav Huna answered, Amale tinituha zerakola letoch cheka o letoch kalta harezo megoreshet. Rav Huna answered, we have the answer in a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah Masechet Gitin. In order to get divorced, the husband has to deliver a get to his wife, and she has to be able to acquire it. So let's say they're at home, in his home, it's a home that he owns, and he throws it into her lap or into her basket. Now her lap, that's her personal space. Okay, so certainly she acquires it, that's with her body. What we're learning from is from her basket. So we're assuming that the basket is on the floor, but it's her basket, and once the get goes and into her basket, she is divorced. So you see that this is the domain of the seller, that's the husband, it's his house, and it's her basket, and when he throws it in, it goes in, and it does belong to her. Basket could be over here like this on her head, but this is talking about something, this would of course be good because it's on her person. We're talking about when it's on the floor, and the Mishnah teaches that yes, indeed, it works. She is divorced, she does acquire it. So there you go. Rav Huna says we have an answer. Amar le Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman tells Rav Huna, I don't like the source that you brought. Ma'itama pashat tele me'ahi demachula me'a ukle be'ukla. Why are you bringing proof from a source that already the sages struck it with 100 strikes of a hammer? Here's a hammer, and the analogy is, let's say you take a rock or something and keep striking it and chipping away pieces of the rock until it's only a little bit left. That's what the sages did to this Mishnah. As we're about to see, the sages gave many limitations on that Mishnah, only if the basket is in a certain place. So therefore, you can't bring a proof from this Mishnah because the sages already banged it down to a specific case. Damar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel, Vehu she'ayta kalta tiluya ba. Shemuel said that she acquires the get only if the basket is hanging from her body, kind of like this one where she's wearing it, or if it's hanging from a strap around her shoulder, around her neck. And in that case, she's actually lifting it up. She actually, it's the same as catching it with your hand. It's just that it's catching it with your clothing or with a basket that's attached to her. But Shemuel says that's the only case where this Mishnah would work, not if it's on the floor. Resh Lakish is a little bit more lenient. He says that the basket on the floor can acquire the get for her as long as the basket is attached to her. There's a rope that's connecting the basket to her, that's when. But if it's not connected to her, no, it wouldn't work. Ravada bar Ahava Amar Kegon Shehaita Kalta Munachat La Ben Yadchoteha. Ravada bar Ahava says it's on the floor, it's not attached to her, but she has her legs around it. She's sitting on the floor and with the basket between her legs. That's when she acquires it, because it's right there within her personal space, but not if it's not right next to her. Rav Mesharshiya bere derebi Ami Amar Kegon Shehaya Ba'ala Mocher Kelatot. Rav Mesharshiya, the son of Rabbi Ameh, says it could be on the floor and not right next to her. And we're talking about a case where the husband is a basket seller. So he has a whole area in his house that's like a warehouse or a showroom. And so the husband doesn't care that she puts her basket there. If it was in his living room, he's like, what was your basket doing in the middle of my living room here? So that he wouldn't want, and it wouldn't work for her to acquire it there because the husband doesn't want it there. But if it's in the middle of his showroom where there's lots of baskets there anyway, and he doesn't mind her basket being there, that's a case where since he doesn't mind the basket being there, it can acquire the get for her. But it's limited still only to that case. Rabbi Yochanan is the most lenient for her behalf. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Mekom chayka kanui la, Mekom kalta kanui la. Amar Rava, my tamad Rabbi Yochanan, lefi she'en adam makpid lo al Mekom chayka, velo al Mekom kalta. Rabbi Yochanan says her lap acquires things for her, and her basket acquires for her, no matter where it is. And Rava explained what's the reason for Rabbi Yochanan, because a person is not particular, my husband is not particular about his wife's lap and the place of her basket. The husband doesn't care that his wife has a basket somewhere in the house. It's okay, you can put your basket there and you can use it, and therefore she acquires it even if it's not attached to her or right next to her or in his showroom. Anywhere is fine. So, Ela Peshot La Meha. So, Rav Nachman tells Rav Huna, why are you learning it from this Mishnah in Gitin? That Mishnah is only in a particular case of a husband putting something in his wife's basket. And at best, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's only because the husband doesn't mind if his wife has a basket in his living room. And according to the other opinions, only if it's attached to her, it's hanging from her, it's between her legs. So these are very limited cases. You see that the rabbis smashed this Mishnah with a hammer multiple times and whittled it down just to a particular case. So this is not such a great source to use to answer the question. Instead, we have a new candidate, Ela Peshot La Meha. Reshut mocher lo kana ad sheyagbihenna or ad sheyosienna mershuto. Maila bechelav de lokeach. So instead, we can answer this question by citing the baraita, the long baraita that we just saw above about the 4 cases. And the second case was talking about the domain of the seller, a store. I come into your store and I say, fill up this container with oil. And it says over there that I do not acquire it until I actually lift up the container or take it out of the store, out of the domain. Now, whose container is it? Is it not talking about the container of the buyer? I bring my own container, just like today you have to bring your own shopping bags to the supermarket. That's what everybody did back then. You bring your container to the store and I say fill it up with oil, and he fills it up. I don't acquire it yet. He can change his mind and take it back until I lift it up. So here we have an answer to the original question. When you have the vessel of a buyer in the domain of a seller, one does not acquire it just because he filled it up, even if he filled it to the top. No, it doesn't work. That's the answer. Isn't that a good proof? We answer, La bechelav de mocher. No, could be it's the vessels of the seller. Maybe I walk in without anything, and the seller says, I ask the seller, I want a gallon of oil, and he uses his own measuring cups, his own container, and fills it up. And then I have to take it and I transfer it afterwards to my container. And that's what it's talking about, and that's why. But if I brought my own container and he put it in my container, then it would work. So there's no proof from here. Or we ask further, now we have to be consistent. If that second case is talking about the vessels of the seller, then the next one, the third case, also must be talking about the vessels of the seller, right? Let's look at that case. Ema sefa. B'shut lokeach, kevan shekibel alav mocher, kana lokeach. V'hi bekelav de mocher, amai kana lokeach. And this is a case where there's a traveling salesman. He comes to my house. He comes into my domain, and he sells it to me. And so there, the Baraita says, once the seller agrees, he says, this is sold to you, right? So it's a sale. Then the buyer acquires it. Now, if you're talking about the vessels of the seller, he comes in and he brings his own measuring cup and he pours it into his own measuring cup. Well, then why should the buyer, the homeowner, acquire it? This is the seller. It's in his own measuring cup. So how could it be that the buyer automatically acquires it when it's still in the seller's vessel? That doesn't make sense. So you want to be consistent. And if that's talking about the second case is the seller's vessel, the third case also should be the seller's vessel, but that doesn't fit. So we answer, Sefa tan lechelav de lokech. You know what? The third case of the Baraita is actually talking about the buyer's vessel. But now we have a problem. What do you mean? The second case is the seller's vessel. The third case is the buyer's vessel. Would the Mishnah jump from one case to another? Umay paska. How can you divide it like that into totally different cases? And the answer is setama de milita be mocher mane de mocher shechiche be lokeach mane de lokeach shechiche. You know, it actually does make sense, because if you assume without knowing anything, if you're in the house of the seller, if you're in a seller's store, then the vessels there probably belong to the seller because he has lots of different vessels there. Whereas if you come to my house, and there's a container, you just say the container, it's probably a container that belongs to the buyer because it's in his house. And so people aren't going to usually travel with measuring cups, but use the measuring cup of wherever you are. So actually the Mishnah reads perfect, the Baraita reads perfectly well if you say that is talking, the second case is that of the seller, the third case is the vessels of the buyer, and therefore there is no proof from this Baraita because we have a case of the domain of the seller with the vessels of the seller. The next case is the domain of the buyer with the vessels of the buyer, but we don't have a case the one that we're looking for of the domain of the seller with the vessels of the buyer. So we still don't have an answer. Finally, we try out a third source in order to answer this question. Amar Rava, Tashema. משך חמריו ופועליו והכניסן לתוך ביתו, בין פסק עד שלא מדד, ובין מדד עד שלא פסק, שניהם יכולים לחזור בהן. We're talking about a case where a seller comes and he has merchandise that's loaded on top of donkeys, and he has donkey drivers that are pulling these donkeys. And he comes to someone's house, he's going door to door, and he's going to sell these items. And so the buyer, the owner of the house, he wants to buy these things, and he pulls the donkey drivers into his house, or the workers that are carrying the merchandise. So you have the seller, he has either donkeys carrying stuff or workers carrying stuff, and the owner of the house, the buyer, brings them in, but they're still carrying the items. They're still on top of the donkey. So he didn't unload them yet. So in that case, when it's still in the vessels of the seller on top of the donkey, then there is no acquisition. Both of them can change their minds. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter whether they fixed a price, that's pasak, but they didn't measure yet, or they measured but didn't fix the price. We're going to see that in the next sentences. This makes a difference whether you set a price or not, measured or not. But here there's no acquisition because the items are still on top of the donkey or being held by the workers. And so it doesn't matter whether they fixed a price or measured it it. Measured it would have to mean that they're measuring it out, but let's say the seller is measuring it out on top of the donkey or something like that. And they didn't go get on the floor or into the vessels of the buyer. So then there's no acquisition. Nothing happened. Since no acquisition happened yet, either of them can change their mind and say forget it and then just leave. פרקן וכניסה לתוך ביתו פסק עד שלא מדד, אין שניהם יכולים לחזור בהן. מדד עד שלא פסק, שניהם יכולים לחזור בהן. However, if they were unloaded, they're still, let's say it's rice, and they're still in the sacks, and the seller takes the sacks off the donkey and puts them on the floor. So now you have a case of items that are in sacks of the seller in the domain of the buyer. Now this is the opposite of the case that of the question that we had, but we're going to assume that it's the same thing. So in such a case where he unloaded them and they're in his house, in that case, if they fixed a price, even though they didn't actually measure it out, then neither of them can change their minds. That's it. It's a final deal. Whereas if they only measured out but didn't fix a price, then either of them can change their minds. The proof is going to be from the first of these cases. The second one, if they didn't fix a price yet, as we're going to see in a minute, then there's no sale because they didn't have in mind. They didn't agree to a price. So there's no agreement to transfer the item. You can't transfer an item if there's no price set. Who knows what price you're going to say? You're going to say some crazy price. Of course, the buyer is going to say, forget it. I never agreed to that price. So if they don't agree on the price, then nothing happens. But here's the key. If they agree, we're talking about where they agreed on the price, and even if they didn't measure it out, that's not as important. But the rice is in the bags of the seller, but it's on the floor in the domain of the buyer. So we can make an analogy. This statement means the opposite of what it seems to mean at the first reading. It says, since the vessels of a seller, when they're in the domain of the buyer, do not make an acquisition. So actually here, the buyer does acquire it. The meaning is that the vessels of the seller don't keep it in the seller's domain because they're in the house of the buyer. So it's the house that's more important, the domain that's more important than the vessels, right? So when it's the seller's vessels in the domain of the buyer, so the buyer gets it. It's a valid sale. They cannot go back. That's what this phrase said. And we learned by analogy that also, the vessels of a buyer, when they're in the domain of a seller, will not acquire it for him. That was the original question, and now we have an answer. If I go into someone's store and I say, hey, fill this up with rice, and it's my vessel, and it's in his store, it does not acquire. I have to pick it up, otherwise it doesn't work, and that's the equivalent of this case. So there you go. Rava did a lot of work, but he found the source that we have to learn from an inference of an inference, but we figured it out, and Rava says, see, brilliant, he has an answer. But not so fast. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, B'sheshefachan. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, wait a second, when it says unload, how do you know it meant that he unloaded the rice while it's still in the bag and put the bag on the floor? Maybe it means he poured out the rice onto the floor. That's what it means. That's what he did. And therefore it's directly on the floor of the buyer, not in a vessel, and therefore has no relevance to our case. Ikpad Rava, midi shefachan katane. Rava got upset at Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. I worked so hard, I found the source, and you're just making up a story. Does the Baraita say poured? Pirkan katane, it says unloaded. Unloaded means you take the whole item off, the whole bag, and you put the whole bag on the floor. If it meant pour, then it should have said pour. So my proof is good, Rava is insisting. Ela amar mor bar Rav Ashe bem takeli detume. Rather, more about Rav Ashe says, actually, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak could be right, and is talking about bundles of garlic. Garlic generally were not transported in bags, but rather they were just strung together with string. And so when you unload them, they're not in a sack. So when you unload them, they go directly on the floor. So it doesn't have to be pour. It could be unloading, and yet it still goes directly on the floor. And therefore, if that's what we're talking about, then it's not a case of the seller's vessel in the domain of the buyer, but rather it's directly on the floor of the buyer, and that certainly works if it's directly on the floor. It's no longer in the seller's domain at all. It's not even in his vessels, and this has no relevance to our case. Amar lehuna bered demor zutra leravina mikedi pirkan katane mali pasak mali lo pasak. So regarding that previous discussion, we end without finding any source to the answer. And now we're just going back, and I want to clarify the last case that we saw in that Baraita. And so Huna, the son of Mor, Zutra asked Ravina, when the Baraita says Pirkan, he unloaded the vessels onto the floor of the buyer, and it said that if he didn't set a price, then there's no acquisition. And his question is, what's the difference if they set a price or not? All right, why should that make a difference? They did an act, so whatever that act is, if it's an acquisition, it should work. If not, not. Why does it matter if they set a price? And his answer is, Amar le pasak samcha da'ateh, lo pasak lo samcha da'ateh. If you set a price, then that means the seller made up his mind that, okay, we have a price, we're going to sell it. You agree. They agreed with the price. The buyer also makes up his mind. But if you don't set a price, then they did not have in mind, they did not make up their mind and decide they really want to sell it. And so therefore, even if you put it in his domain, there's no acquisition that happened because they did not fix in their mind that they actually want to sell it. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.